Sarah Martinez thought she knew her neighbor, Karen, well enough until she found the bright orange abandoned vehicle sticker plastered across her windshield at 6 a.m. on a Tuesday morning. What Karen didn't know was that Sarah had been documenting every drop of oil that had been pooling under Karen's pristine white Mercedes for the past 3 months. Sometimes the best revenge comes with a paper trail. And Sarah was about to teach her neighbor that two could play the HOA reporting game. But when the tow truck showed up at Karen's door instead of hers, neither woman realized they had just started a war that would tear their D-orange violation sticker caught the morning light like a neon sign of humiliation, its adhesive edges already beginning to curl in the September heat. Sarah Martinez stood in her driveway, coffee mug trembling in her hand, staring at the bureaucratic slap across her Honda Civic's windshield. Abandoned vehicle notice, it screamed in bold black letters. This vehicle appears to have been abandoned on private property. If not moved within 72 hours, it will be subject to towing at owner's expense. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. Her car hadn't moved in for days, true, but only because she'd been working 12-hour shifts at the hospital, covering for a colleague who'd caught pneumonia. The Civic sat exactly where it always did, in her assigned parking spot in the Meadowbrook Gardens HOA complex, the same spot she'd paid for with her monthly dues for the past 2 years. "Unbelievable," she whispered, then louder, "Unfucking believable." "Problem, Sarah." The voice dripped with artificial sweetness. Sarah turned to see Karen Whitmore, approaching from across the narrow street, her platinum blonde hair perfectly styled despite the early hour. Her yoga outfit coordinated in shades of mint green that probably cost more than Sarah's monthly grocery budget. "Someone reported my car as abandoned." Sarah held up the sticker, her voice tight with controlled anger. "Can you believe that? For days without moving, and suddenly I'm some kind of neighborhood menace." Karen's expression shifted into what Sarah had come to recognize as her concerned neighbor, fesibrows slightly raised, lips pursed in a way that suggested deep thought and empathy. It was the same expression she'd worn when she'd helpfully pointed out that Sarah's welcome mat was 2 inches over the property line, or when she'd mentioned that the small wind chime on Sarah's balcony might be disturbing the tranquil atmosphere of their community. "Oh my," Karen said, stepping closer to examine the sticker. "That is unfortunate, though I have to say, I did notice your car hadn't moved lately. In fact, I was just mentioning to my husband Greg last night how still everything looked. You know how these things can snowball if they're not addressed quickly." The coffee mug slipped slightly in Sarah's grip. Mentioning to Greg, "Well, yes, Greg's on the HOA board, vice president of community standards." Karen's smile broadened, revealing teeth so white they seemed to glow. "He takes his responsibilities very seriously. We both do. It's what makes Meadowbrook Gardens such a wonderful place to live." Sarah felt heat creeping up her neck. "Karen, are you telling me you reported my car?" "Oh, goodness, no." Karen's laugh was like wind chimes in a hurricane delicate, but somehow discordant. "I would never do such a thing. I simply mentioned to my husband that I'd noticed some irregularities in the parking situation. What he chose to do with that information is entirely his prerogative as an HOA board member." Sarah repeated the word slowly, tasting its bitter formality. "My car, parked in my assigned spot, is an irregularity. Now, don't take it personally, dear. Rules are rules. The HOA handbook clearly states that vehicles must be moved at least once every 72 hours to prevent the appearance of abandonment. It's all about maintaining property values, you understand." Sarah's coffee had grown cold, but she gripped the mug tighter anyway, using it as an anchor against the surge of rage building in her chest. She'd read the HOA handbook when she'd moved in all 47 pages of ITAND. She knew the 72-hour rule existed, but she also knew it was typically enforced only when vehicles were obviously broken down or genuinely abandoned. Her car was clean, registered, and parked properly. This wasn't about rules. This was about Karen flexing her power through her husband's position on the board. "I work at St. Mary's Hospital," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the fury burning in her throat. "I've been pulling double shifts because we're short-staffed. I haven't had time to move my car to go grocery shopping, let alone drive around the block to satisfy some arbitrary rule interpretation." Karen's expression softened into something that might have been sympathy if Sarah hadn't known better. Oh, healthcare workers. You all work so hard. It's really admirable. But, dear, personal circumstances don't really override community standards. We all have our challenges, but we can't let the neighborhood suffer because of them. The condescension in Karen's voice was like a match struck in a room full of gasoline. Sarah felt something inside her shift, a tectonic plate of patience, finally reaching its breaking point. She'd been polite to Karen for 2 years. She'd smiled through the passive-aggressive comments about her flower boxes being a bit too colorful for the aesthetic, and she'd nodded along when Karen had explained why. Sarah's choice to hang her scrubs on the balcony to dry was not really keeping with the community standards we're trying to maintain. But this was different. This was Karen using her husband's position to actively interfere with Sarah's life, to cause her real problems, real stress, real consequences. And the way she was standing there, smiling that perfect smile, pretending. This was all just an unfortunate coincidence. It was too much. You know what, Karen? Sarah set her coffee mug down on the hood of her car with a sharp click. You're absolutely right about community standards. Karen blinked, clearly not expecting agreement. Oh, well, good. I'm glad you understand. I do understand. In fact, I understand so well that I think I should start paying more attention to how all of us are maintaining those standards. Sarah pulled her phone from her pocket and opened the camera app. For instance, I couldn't help but notice that there's been a rather large oil stain developing under your Mercedes. Karen's perfect composure flickered for just a moment, like a candle flame in a breeze. I'm sorry, the oil stain. Under your car, it's been growing for months now. Sarah began walking toward Karen's parking spot, her phone held up to capture the evidence. According to Section 12.4 of the HOA handbook, residents are responsible for preventing automotive fluids from contaminating common areas. That includes parking spaces. Karen hurried to keep up, her yoga outfit suddenly looking less perfectly coordinated and more like a costume that was beginning to slip. That's not mean. That's just a tiny spot. All cars have minor leaks. This doesn't look minor to me. Sarah crouched down next to Karen's white Mercedes, angling her phone to capture the dark stain. That had indeed been spreading across the concrete for the better part of 3 months. It was roughly the size of a dinner plate now, with smaller, satellite stains scattered around it, like a constellation of automotive neglect. This looks like a clear violation of community standards, the kind of thing that could really impact property values if left unchecked. Sarah, this is ridiculous. You're being petty. Sarah stood up, her phone now containing a comprehensive photographic record of Karen's oil leak. She looked at her neighbor, really looked at her hand, saw something she'd never noticed before. Beneath the perfect hair and coordinated outfits, beneath the confident smile and authoritative tone, Karen looked genuinely rattled. The woman who had spent 2 years nitpicking every aspect of Sarah's life, who had just orchestrated an official complaint about a car that had been parked legally in its assigned spot, was now calling someone else petty. Petty, Sarah repeated, tasting the word. You know what's petty, Karen? Reporting someone's car as abandoned because you don't like that they work too hard to move it every 3 days. You know what's not petty? Following the same rules you insisted were so important. Karen's face was beginning to flush, the perfect makeup failing to hide the red creeping up from her neck. This is completely different. You're talking about a minor maintenance issue. I'm talking about community standards. Are you? Because Section 12.4 seems pretty clear about automotive fluid contamination. It's right there in black. And white residents must take immediate action to prevent vehicle fluids from staining or damaging common areas. Immediate action, Karen. Not when it's convenient or when the stain gets big enough to bother someone. Immediate. Sarah began typing on her phone, her fingers moving with the precision of someone who had spent years documenting medical charts. I'm just going to send these photos to Greg, since he's so concerned about community standards. I'm sure he'll want to know about this violation as soon as possible. You wouldn't dare. The words came out sharper than Karen had probably intended, and Sarah looked up from her phone to see her neighbor's perfectly constructed facade finally beginning to crack. Gone was the sweet, concerned neighbor routine. In its place stood a woman who was used to being in control, used to being the one who pointed out other people's violations, used to... Sarah's phone buzzed at 11:47 p.m., 3 days after she'd sent the oil leak photos to Greg Whitmore. She'd been expecting some kind of response, but not at nearly midnight on a Friday. The caller ID showed HOA board office, Greg's personal number that he used for official HOA business. Sarah Martinez speaking. Ms. Martinez, this is Greg Whitmore from the HOA board. His voice was tight, professional, but Sarah could hear something else underneath irritation, maybe even anger. I need to speak with you about a complaint that was filed regarding parking violations and property damage. Sarah sat up in bed, instantly alert. Property damage. Yes, it seems there's been an incident involving your vehicle and damage to HOA property. I'm calling to inform you that there will be an emergency board meeting tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. to address this matter. Your attendance is mandatory. Wait, what? What incident? What damage? Sarah's heart was racing now. Greg, I have no idea what you're talking about. The oil stain under your parking space? Ms. Martinez, we've received photographic evidence that your vehicle has been leaking automotive fluids onto HOA property for an extended period, causing permanent damage to the concrete surface. Sarah felt the world tilt sideways. My oil stain? Greg, my car doesn't leak oil. I just had it serviced 2 weeks ago. The photographs clearly show extensive contamination directly beneath your assigned parking space. The board takes environmental violations very seriously. Ms. Martinez, this isn't just about community standards anymore. This is about property damage that could cost the HOA thousands of dollars to remediate. Sarah's mouth went dry. She stumbled out of bed and rushed to her window, peering down at her parking space. Even in the dim glow of the security lights, she could see it a dark stain spread across the concrete beneath her Honda Civic, easily twice the size of the stain she'd photographed under Karen's Mercedes. That's impossible, she whispered. Into the phone, Greg. That stain wasn't there yesterday. I would have noticed, Ms. Martinez. Environmental damage doesn't happen overnight. This type of contamination builds up over months of neglect. Frankly, I'm disappointed that you would try to deflect responsibility when presented with clear evidence. Sarah's hands were shaking now. Evidence? What evidence? Who took these photographs? That's not relevant. What's relevant is that the board now has documented proof of a serious violation that's been ongoing for months. We're looking at potential fines, remediation costs, and possible legal action depending on the extent of the environmental impact. The line went quiet for a moment, and Sarah could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. This was impossible. Her car had been inspected just 2 weeks ago. No leaks, no mechanical issues, nothing. She parked in that same spot every day and had never seen any stain until right now. Greg, she said slowly, I need to see these photographs. They'll be presented at the board meeting tomorrow, 9 a.m. sharp, Community Center Conference Room. Don't be late, Ms. Martinez. This is a serious matter. The line went dead. Sarah stared at her phone, then back out the window at the stain that had somehow materialized under her car. She grabbed her robe and headed downstairs, her bare feet slapping against the cold concrete as she rushed outside. Under the harsh light of her phone's flashlight, the stain looked even worse. It was fresh, she could tell, because the edges were still dark and wet-looking, not the faded gray of old automotive stains. And there was something else. The pattern was wrong. Oil leaks from cars created specific patterns based on where the vehicle was parked and how the fluids dripped. This stain was too uniform, too perfectly centered, like someone had poured liquid directly onto the concrete. Son of a bitch, Sarah breathed. Having car troubles, neighbor. Sarah spun around to find Karen standing at the edge of her own parking space, wearing a silk robe and an expression of false concern. Even at midnight, her hair was perfect, her makeup subtle but flawless. You did this. It wasn't a question. Karen's eyebrows rose in practiced innocence. Did what, dear? I was just coming out to check on my own car. Greg mentioned there might be some automotive fluid issues in the complex. I wanted to make sure my Mercedes wasn't contributing to any problems. Sarah looked over at Karen's parking space. The oil stain that had been there for months, the stain she'd photographed and sent to Greg, was gone. The concrete was spotless, as if it had been pressure washed and sealed. You cleaned up your stain and created one under my car. Sarah, that's a very serious accusation. Are you suggesting I would tamper with HOA property? That I would somehow manufacture evidence of environmental violations? Karen's voice carried just the right note of hurt confusion, but her eyes were cold and calculating. That sounds rather paranoid, don't you think? I photographed your oil stain 3 days ago. I sent those photos to Greg. Now suddenly, My car has a stain, and yours is spotless." Karen stepped closer, and in the harsh glow of the security lights, her perfectly composed expression finally showed its true nature. "You know, Sarah, I tried to handle our little parking situation quietly. A simple reminder about community standards, a gentle nudge to be more considerate of your neighbors. But then you had to escalate things. You had to make it personal. I made it personal. You reported my car as abandoned. I reported a violation of community standards. But you," Karen's voice dropped to a whisper, "you tried to destroy my reputation. You tried to make me look like a hypocrite in front of my husband, in front of the entire HOA board. Did you really think there wouldn't be consequences?" Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. "You actually did this. You actually poured oil under my car." "I have no idea what you're talking about. What I do know is that environmental violations are taken very seriously by the HOA, much more seriously than minor parking infractions. The remediation costs alone could run into the thousands, and if the EPA gets involved," Karen let the threat hang in the air. "The EPA? Karen, you can't be serious." "Oh, I'm very serious. Automotive fluid contamination on common property is an environmental issue. Sarah, the board has a legal obligation to report significant violations to the appropriate authorities, and based on the photographic evidence Greg showed me, this is definitely significant." Sarah's mind raced. An EPA investigation could mean massive fines, legal bills, potential criminal charges for environmental contamination. Even if she could eventually prove the stain was planted, the investigation process alone could destroy her financially and professionally. Nurses couldn't afford to have environmental violations on their records. "You're insane," Sarah whispered. "I'm thorough," Karen corrected. "I researched environmental law quite extensively after you sent those photos to my husband. Did you know that property owners can be held personally liable for automotive fluid contamination, even if they weren't aware it was happening? Ignorance isn't a defense under environmental protection statutes." Karen began walking back toward her apartment, but paused at the edge of the light. "Oh, and Sarah, that little sticker on your windshield. You might want to move your car before the 72 hours are up. Adding vehicle abandonment to environmental contamination would be unfortunate." Sarah stood alone in the parking lot, staring at the fabricated evidence that could ruin her life, while the woman who had created it disappeared into the darkness, with a soft laugh that sounded like breaking glass. At 3 a.m., Sarah was still awake, still researching environmental law on her laptop, still trying to figure out how to prove that the oil stain under her car had been planted. But every legal website she found confirmed Karen's threat environmental contamination was serious business. And property owners were held strictly liable, regardless of intent or knowledge. Karen had just escalated their neighborly dispute into something that could destroy Sarah's career, her finances, and her future. And she'd done it with the kind of cold, calculated precision that spoke of careful planning and ruthless execution. The war between them was no longer about spaces or community standards. It was about survival. Sarah arrived at the HOA board meeting 15 minutes early, armed with a manila folder thick with printouts, photographs, and documents she'd compiled during her sleepless night. The community center conference room smelled like stale coffee. An industrial carpet cleaner, its fluorescent lights casting everything in an unflattering yellow glow. Greg Whitmore sat at the head of the rectangular table, his thinning hair combed over with mathematical precision. His tie knotted so tightly it seemed to be cutting off circulation to his face. Beside him sat two other board members Sarah recognized, but had never spoken to Mrs. Chen from Building C, and Mr. Rodriguez from the townhouses. Karen wasn't present, but Sarah could feel her influence in the room like a toxic cloud. "Ms. Martinez," Greg began without preamble, "thank you for coming. We need to discuss the environmental contamination issue that was brought to the board's attention." "Before we discuss anything," Sarah said, setting her folder on the table with deliberate force, "I need to see the photographs you mentioned." Last night, Greg's jaw tightened. "Ms. Martinez, this isn't a negotiation. The board has documented evidence of extensive oil contamination beneath your assigned parking space. The question now is how you plan to address the remediation costs and prevent further environmental damage." "Show me the photographs, Greg." The tension in the room was thick enough to cut. Mrs. Chen shifted uncomfortably in her seat, while Mr. Rodriguez seemed fascinated by his own hands. Greg stared at Sarah for a long moment, then reached into a folder and produced a stack of color prints. Sarah's breath caught as she saw the images. The oil stain under her car looked massive in the photographs, easily 3 times larger than what she'd observed in person. The pictures had been taken from multiple angles, with rulers placed next to the contamination to show scale. But there was something wrong with the images, something that made Sarah's investigative instincts, honed by years of documenting medical evidence, start firing rapidly. "These photos were taken yesterday?" she asked. "According to the timestamp, yes." Friday afternoon around 2 p.m., Sarah pulled out her own folder and extracted a series of photographs. She'd taken at 6 a.m. that same Friday morning images of her parking space showing clean concrete with no contamination whatsoever. She placed them next to Greg's photos. "That's interesting," she said, "because I documented my parking space every morning this week. Here's Friday at 6 a.m. no stain. According to your photos, this massive contamination appeared in 8 hours." Greg's confidence wavered slightly. Environmental contamination can manifest suddenly when underlying damage reaches a critical threshold. "Bullshit," Sarah's voice cut through his explanation like a blade. "I'm a nurse, Greg. I document everything, and I've been documenting this parking situation since Tuesday, when someone," she looked directly at him, "reported my car as abandoned." She spread out a series of photographs across the table. Tuesday morning, 6 a.m. no stain. Wednesday morning, 6 a.m. no stain. Thursday morning, 6 a.m. no stain. Friday morning, 6 a.m. no stain. Friday night at midnight suddenly, there's massive contamination that supposedly took months to develop. Mrs. Chen leaned forward to examine the photographs. "These timestamps show you've been monitoring your parking space daily. I started monitoring everything after the abandoned vehicle report. Call it professional paranoia, but when someone starts scrutinizing my property, I tend to document things thoroughly." Sarah pulled out another set of photos. "But here's what's really interesting. These are photos I took of Karen Whitmore's parking space on Tuesday morning, showing a significant oil stain that had been developing for months." Greg's face went pale as Sarah spread out the images of Karen's Mercedes and the substantial oil contamination beneath it. And here, Sarah continued, producing photos from Friday night. "Is Karen's parking space 12 hours ago. Spotless, professionally cleaned. Now, I'm no expert, but isn't it curious that Karen's months-old contamination disappeared the same day massive contamination appeared under my car?" The conference room fell silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights. Mr. Rodriguez had stopped examining his hands and was now staring at the photographs with obvious interest. Mrs. Chen was taking notes. "Are you suggesting," Greg said slowly, "that someone planted evidence of environmental contamination?" "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm presenting documented evidence of what happened and when it happened. Draw your own conclusions." Sarah reached into her folder one more time and produced a receipt. "This is from Murphy's Auto Service. My car was inspected 2 weeks ago. No leaks, no mechanical issues. The mechanic specifically noted no visible fluid leaks in his report." She placed the receipt on top of the photographs. "So we have a car with no mechanical issues, documented daily photos showing no contamination, and then suddenly massive environmental damage appears overnight, while a months-old oil stain disappears from another vehicle in the same time frame." Greg was quiet for a long moment, studying the evidence spread across the table. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful, measured. "What exactly are you asking the board to do with this information?" "I'm asking the board to investigate how evidence of environmental contamination was manufactured and planted on my property. I'm asking you to determine who had access to my parking space and the materials necessary to create a fake oil stain. And I'm asking you to explain why your wife knew about environmental law regulations before this contamination was officially reported." The words hung in the air like an accusation. Greg's face cycled through several colors: pale red, then an unhealthy gray. "My wife has nothing to do with this board's decision-making process, doesn't she?" Sarah pulled out her phone and opened a voice recording app. "This is from last night's conversation with Karen. I recorded it because I wanted to make sure I remembered her exact words." She pressed play, and Karen's voice filled the conference room with crystal clarity. "You know, Sarah, I tried to handle our little parking situation quietly, ... But then you had to escalate things. You had to make it personal. Did you really think there wouldn't be consequences? I researched environmental law quite extensively after you sent those photos to my husband. Property owners can be held personally liable for automotive fluid contamination. The recording continued for 2 more minutes, capturing Karen's detailed knowledge of environmental regulations, her threats about EPA involvement, and most damning of all, her admission that she had researched environmental law quite extensively. After receiving Sarah's complaint about her own oil leak, when the recording ended, the conference room was dead silent. Mrs. Chen had stopped taking notes and was staring at Greg with an expression of barely controlled disgust. Mr. Rodriguez was shaking his head slowly. "Jesus Christ," Greg Rodriguez muttered. "Please tell me your wife didn't actually plant evidence to frame this woman." Greg's carefully constructed authority was crumbling like a sandcastle in the tide. I don't. Karen wouldn't. Wife demonstrated extensive knowledge of environmental law, admitted to researching it specifically after my complaint, and made direct threats about EPA involvement, Sarah said. She also somehow cleaned up months of oil contamination from her own vehicle in the same time frame that massive contamination appeared under mine. How do you explain that? I can't, Greg whispered. Mrs. Chen cleared her throat. I move that the board immediately suspend any action regarding environmental contamination. Pending a full investigation into these allegations, all evidence suggests that Ms. Martinez has been the victim of harassment and potentially criminal tampering with HOA property. Seconded, Rodriguez said immediately. Greg sat in stunned silence as his fellow board members dismantled the case. His wife had orchestrated. Furthermore, Mrs. Chen continued, I recommend that the board consider filing a complaint with local law enforcement regarding the apparent planting of false evidence and the harassment of an HOA resident. Sarah felt a surge of vindication so powerful it made her dizzy. But then she looked at Greg's devastated expression and felt something else pity. His wife had just destroyed his credibility and possibly his marriage with her twisted revenge scheme. There's one more thing, Sarah said quietly. She reached into her folder and produced a final document. This is a soil sample analysis I had done this morning by an environmental testing company. The contamination under my car isn't engine oil. It's cooking oil mixed with motor oil additive to change the color and consistency. The confession hung in the air like a death sentence. Greg buried his face in his hands. Your wife, literally, cooked up fake evidence to frame me for environmental contamination, Sarah said. The question now is, what are you going to do about it?